I woke up gasping, my hands pressed to my stomach. No, I whispered. This can't be real. My room looked wrong. Too clean. Too familiar. I sat up fast and said, I died. I remember dying. My heart pounded as I swung my legs off the bed. Calm down, I told myself. Think. I walked to the mirror and froze. That's me, I said softly. Young. Alive. My face had no scars, no shadows. I touched my belly again and felt it. I'm pregnant, I whispered. The same pregnancy. My knees weakened. This is when everything ended. I leaned on the sink and said, You're dreaming. Wake up. I pinched my arm. Pain shot through me. Not a dream, I said. Memories flooded in, sharp and cruel. Ethan, I breathed. You asked for a divorce. My throat tightened. You chose her. I remembered begging, crying, falling on cold floors alone. I lost everything, I said. Even myself. My chest hurt as I remembered the hospital lights, the silence, the way my life faded. I died loving you, I whispered. I looked at my reflection and said, Why am I back? My voice shook. Is this a joke? I laughed once, broken and ugly. Or a punishment? I closed my eyes and said, No. I remember too much. I opened them and met my own gaze. This is real. My hands trembled as I said, I'm back before the divorce. Fear crept in. Do I have to live it again? I shook my head hard. No, I won't. I pressed my palm to the mirror and said, Listen to me. My voice grew firm. I won't beg this time. Tears filled my eyes. I won't disappear for love. I took a deep breath. I loved blindly before. I swallowed. It killed me. I wiped my face and said, I'm still scared. My voice softened. But I'm not weak. I felt the baby move and whispered, You're here too. My breath hitched. I failed you once. I rested my forehead against the glass. I won't fail again. A memory surfaced, clear and cruel. Ethan's calm voice saying, It's for the best. I said aloud, You didn't even look guilty. My hands curled into fists. You protected her. Anger burned, then faded. No, I said slowly. I won't hate you. I straightened. I'll survive you. The room felt smaller, but my mind felt sharp. This is my second chance, I said. And I choose myself. I stepped back and studied my face. Remember this moment, I told myself. Remember the pain. I inhaled deeply, because I will not forget again. My lips trembled as I added, I won't chase love that throws me away. I glanced at the door and whispered, Ethan Miller. My voice was steady. You will break me once. I shook my head. Never twice. I picked up my phone and saw the date. My heart skipped. It's before everything, I said. Before the papers. Before the lies. I sat on the bed slowly. Okay, I murmured. I'm ready. I placed both hands on my stomach and whispered, We are ready. My tears fell, but my voice stayed calm. This life will be different. I looked up and said, I swear it. Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, I think we should divorce. I looked at him and replied, You sound very sure. He nodded and said, This is the calmest solution for everyone. I folded my hands and answered, For everyone except me. He avoided my eyes and said, Please don't make this harder. I almost laughed and said, You already did. Silence stretched between us, thick and painful. He cleared his throat and added, I want peace. I asked, Peace for who? He hesitated and said, For all of us. I felt my chest tighten, but my voice stayed flat. I said, Say her name. He stiffened and replied, There's no need. I leaned back and said, Lily Carter. His eyes widened. I continued, She's pregnant, right? He whispered, Yes. I smiled bitterly and said, So am I. His jaw tightened. He said, That's why this must be fair. I remembered kneeling in my past life, begging him to stay. This time I said nothing. He grew uncomfortable and said, "Aren't you going to argue?" I asked, "Would it change anything?" He answered softly, "No." I nodded and said, "Then why waste breath?" My baby moved inside me, sharp and real. I pressed my palm to my stomach and whispered, "I know." Ethan noticed and looked away. He pushed the papers forward and said, "I'll make sure you're provided for." I asked, "Out of guilt?" He flinched and replied, "Out of responsibility." I picked up the pen and said, "You sound noble." He said, "I'm trying to do the right thing." I met his eyes and answered, "For the woman you love." He stayed silent. The door opened and Margaret Miller walked in. She glanced at the papers and said, "So it's settled." I looked at her and replied, "You seem pleased." She sniffed and said, "This is best for the family." I asked, "Which family?" She frowned and said, "Don't be difficult." I smiled and answered, "I stopped trying to please you." I signed the papers slowly. Ethan stared and asked, "That's it?" I slid the pen back and said, "You wanted peace." His voice shook as he said, "You're not crying." I replied, "I already did that once." He whispered, "You're scaring me." I stood and said, "You should be." I picked up my bag and walked to the door. Margaret said, "Don't expect help later." I turned and answered, "I don't expect anything anymore." Ethan followed and said, "We can still talk." I looked at him and replied, "We are done talking." My hand rested on my stomach as I added, "I'm done begging." I stepped outside and breathed in deeply. Behind me, the door closed. I whispered to myself, "This is different." My heart ached, but my spine stayed straight. I walked away and said, "This is where my life changes." After the divorce, people waited for me to fall apart. I heard whispers saying, "She won't survive this." I packed my bags quietly and said to the empty room, "I already survived worse." No goodbye parties. No scenes. I left without explaining anything. At night, I sat on my bed and whispered, "It still hurts." The silence answered back. I pressed my face into the pillow and said, "Just cry once." Tears soaked the fabric as I muttered, "Only once." When the tears stopped, I said, "Get up." My phone buzzed. I read Ethan's name and said, "No." I let it ring. Another message came. "Why aren't you answering?" I locked the screen and said, "Because silence is my answer." Sophia Reed knocked on my door 2 days later. She looked at me and said, "You're too calm." I smiled faintly and replied, "I'm tired of screaming." She sat beside me and asked, "Are you okay?" I answered, "No, but I will be." She frowned and said, "You're different." I nodded. "I died once," I said. "I won't die again." She reached for my hand and whispered, "You loved him." I said, "I loved the idea of him." She asked, "Do you hate him?" I shook my head and replied, "I'm done feeding him my feelings." She smiled sadly and said, "That scares people." That night, I checked my phone again. 5 missed calls. I muttered, still confused. A message popped up. "Please talk to me." I replied with nothing. The next day, Lily sent a message. "I hope you're healing." I laughed softly and said, "Now you're nervous." I typed nothing. I deleted the chat. My body felt heavy, but my mind felt clear. I stood in the kitchen and said, "Eat." I forced myself to swallow soup and whispered, "For the baby." I touched my stomach and added, "It's just us now." Sophia called and said, "People are asking questions." I replied, "Let them." She asked, "You don't care?" I said, "I care about breathing." Another call came from Ethan. I answered once and said, "What?" He sounded shocked. "Why won't you talk to me?" I replied, "Because you asked for freedom." He said, "You're acting strange." I answered, "You're just not used to silence." He paused. I hung up. That night, loneliness crept in. I whispered, "This is the hardest part." My chest tightened. I said, "Stay strong." I cried quietly and added, "Tomorrow will come." In the morning, I stood by the window and said, "I choose calm." I deleted more messages. I scheduled a doctor appointment. I told myself, "Live." Sophia texted, "Proud of you." I replied, "I'm scared." She answered, "That means you're growing." I placed both hands on my stomach and whispered, "We don't need noise." Outside, the world kept spinning. Inside, I finally felt still. I said softly, "Let them be confused." I straightened my shoulders and added, "My silence is enough." I sat across from Daniel Wright and said, "I need this job." He studied my resume and replied, "You're overqualified." I smiled and said, "I'm also desperate." He paused, then said, "Honesty helps." I nodded. He asked, "Can you handle pressure?" I answered, "I survived divorce and pregnancy at the same time." He looked up and said, "When can you start?" On my first day, I whispered to myself, "Don't mess this up." Daniel said, "Take your time." I replied, "I don't have that luxury." He glanced at my stomach and said, "We support working mothers." I breathed out and answered, "Thank you." At lunch, I sat alone and said, "You're doing this." My phone buzzed with a low balance alert. I muttered, "I know." I opened my notebook and whispered, "Focus." That night, I counted money on the table and said, "Enough for rent." I laughed once and added, "Barely." I pressed my hands to my stomach and said, "We'll manage." Daniel called me into his office days later. He said, "Your designs are sharp." I replied, "I can do better." He smiled slightly and said, "I believe you." I walked out and whispered, "Someone finally does." Margaret called that evening. She said, "How are you?" I replied, "Busy." She cleared her throat and said, "The house feels chaotic." I answered, "You wanted me gone." She snapped, "That's not what I meant." I said, "It's what happened." She sighed and said, "Ethan is struggling." I replied, "So am I." She paused. I added, "But I'm not calling you." She said, "You're being cold." I answered, "I'm being careful." I hung up with shaking hands. Later, Ethan texted, "Mom says you won't help." I typed back, "You divorced me." He replied, "You used to care." I stared at the screen and said aloud, "I still care." Then I whispered, "Just not for you." I didn't send anything else. Workdays grew longer. I told Daniel, "I can stay late." He said, "Go home and rest." I replied, "Rest doesn't pay bills." He answered, "Burnout costs more." At home, exhaustion hit hard. I said, "Don't give up." My body ached. I whispered, "One more day." Sophia visited and said, "You look tired." I smiled and replied, "But alive." She asked, "Do you miss him?" I said, "I miss who I was." She nodded and said, "You're stronger now." One afternoon, Daniel handed me a contract. He said, "Full-time." I stared and asked, "Are you serious?" He replied, "You earned it." My voice broke as I said, "Thank you." I walked outside and whispered, "We're okay." I felt my baby move and said, "See." Tears filled my eyes. Margaret called again days later. I didn't answer. Ethan sent another message. I deleted it. Standing in my kitchen, I said, "I don't need revenge." I touched my stomach and added, "I need stability." I looked at my reflection and said, "Survival is enough." That night, I lay down and whispered, "I'm proud of you." My heart felt steady. I closed my eyes and said, "This is my power now." I heard their life was perfect now. That's what people said. I smiled and whispered, "Perfect things crack first." Sophia sat across from me and said, "Lily keeps asking about you." I raised an eyebrow and replied, "That sounds exhausting." She leaned closer and added, "She's scared." I asked, "Of me?" Sophia nodded. I laughed softly and said, "I haven't said a word." At night, I stared at the ceiling and said, "Why do I feel nothing?" Part of me wanted to laugh. Another part felt old and tired. I whispered, "This is what letting go feels like." Ethan called again. I didn't answer. A message followed. "Are you really okay?" I said out loud, too late to care. A week later, I sat in Jacob Lee's office. He looked at me and said, "You don't look like someone seeking revenge." I replied, "I'm seeking protection." He nodded and asked, "For the child?" I touched my stomach and answered, "Always." He slid papers across the desk and said, "This is straightforward." I asked, "No drama?" He smiled slightly and said, "Only if they create it." I signed and whispered, "Do it quietly." He replied, "That's my specialty." Walking out, I said, "That was easier than begging." Jacob answered, "Strength usually is." Days later, Ethan showed up at my door unannounced. I opened it halfway and asked, "Why are you here?" He held the legal notice and said, "What is this?" I replied, "Responsibility." His voice shook as he said, "You hired a lawyer." I nodded. He whispered, "You planned this." I answered, "I prepared." He stepped closer and said, "You never used to fight me." I looked at him and replied, "You never respected me." He flinched. I added, "Now we are both learning." Lily called that night. Her voice was sharp. "You're trying to ruin us." I replied calmly, "I'm raising my child." She snapped, "Ethan still thinks about you." I laughed once and said, "That's between you and him." She yelled, "You're doing this on purpose." I answered, "I'm doing nothing." I hung up. Sophia texted, "He's fighting with her." I replied, "I figured." She asked, "How do you feel?" I stared at the screen and typed, "Tired." At work, Daniel handed me coffee and said, "You look distracted." I answered, "Old chapters closing." He nodded and said, "New ones open fast." Another message came from Ethan. "I didn't know you were this strong." I whispered, "Neither did I." I deleted it. That evening, I sat alone and said, "Karma doesn't need help." I remembered how I once waited for apologies. I said, "I don't need them anymore." Sophia visited and said, "Lily moved out for a night." I replied, "Temporary fixes always fail." She asked, "Do you feel bad?" I shook my head and said, "I feel free." I lay in bed and whispered, "I'm not celebrating." My baby moved gently. I smiled and said, "I'm just done hurting." Days passed. Ethan stopped calling. Lily stopped pretending. Standing by the window, I said, "This isn't revenge." I touched my stomach and added, "This is consequence." I exhaled slowly and whispered, "Let it fall." The rain tapped on the door when I heard a knock. I opened it halfway and whispered, "Ethan." He looked soaked and nervous. I need to talk," he said. I leaned against the frame and replied, "Now." He nodded, shivering. "I made a mistake," he admitted. I raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" I asked. He shook his head. Can we? I just want to explain." I stepped aside and said, "Come in. But I won't cry this time." He hesitated, then walked into the living room. The room smelled faintly of rain. I glanced at Emma Collins, who smiled softly. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. I nodded and whispered, "Thank you." Ethan sat and said, "You look different." I crossed my legs and replied, "I'm living." He swallowed hard and asked, "I lost you, didn't I?" I said calmly, "You lost the version of me that begged." He flinched. I thought. "I could fix things," he murmured. I answered, "Some things can't be fixed with apologies." He stared at my stomach. You're still carrying." I nodded and said, "We are doing fine." He whispered, "I didn't know you'd survive this, alone." I leaned back and replied, "I always could." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "I was wrong, I see that now," he said. I looked him in the eyes. "Are you saying sorry, or asking for me back?" He paused. He began. I interrupted. Answer honestly. I'm stronger than I was. Emma returned with tea. She handed me a cup and whispered, "Everything okay?" I smiled and said, "Better than okay." Ethan's gaze flicked between us. I introduced her gently. "This is Emma. She's been helping me with the pregnancy." He nodded slowly. "I see," he said, voice tight. I leaned forward. "Do you notice something?" He frowned. "I'm calm. I'm confident. I built a life without you. That's my strength now." He swallowed and whispered, "I didn't realize." I said, "You realize now. And it's too late." He looked at the floor. "I never wanted this," he said. I shrugged lightly. "I know. But your choices made it happen." He glanced up, searching my face. "Do you hate me?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. Hate is wasted energy. I learned that." I sipped my tea and said, "I forgive," quietly. "But I don't go back." He swallowed hard and muttered, "You're unshakable." I smiled faintly. "I just choose peace over chaos." Emma returned to her duties, giving us space. He said, "I thought you'd crumble." I leaned back and replied, "I did crumble once. Not this time." He nodded, voice small. "I wanted us to be something." I whispered, "We were something. But I'm not hers or yours anymore." He ran a hand across his face. "I can't change the past." I said, "No, but I can control my future." His lips parted, but no words came. I added softly, "I'm proud of who I became. And I don't need your approval." Rain tapped harder on the windows. He stood and whispered, I should go." I nodded and replied, "Yes. That's best for both of us." He hesitated at the door, then said, I'm sorry again." I smiled faintly. "I know. Goodbye, Ethan." The door closed behind him. I leaned against it and exhaled. Emma returned and said, "You okay?" I placed a hand on my stomach. "I'm better than okay," I said, quietly. The storm outside faded. Inside, I finally felt the calm. I heard whispers before anyone said a word. "Did you hear about Lily's baby?" someone asked. I sipped my coffee and said, "No, what about it?" She might not be Ethan's," they whispered. I froze. Then I laughed softly, bitterly. "Finally," I murmured. Sophia called soon after. "Are you okay?" she asked. I replied, "I've never been better. That burden is gone." She asked, "You're not angry?" I shook my head. Not at her. Not anymore. It's not mine to carry. Later, Lily confronted me outside a cafe. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she hissed. I looked at her and said, "I'm enjoying nothing. I'm relieved." Her eyes flashed. "You've ruined my life." I replied calmly, "I didn't. The truth did." She took a step closer. "You think you're better than me?" I folded my arms and said, "I don't think. I know I survived what you couldn't." Her hand shook. "You'll pay for this." I laughed softly. "I won't. Karma is handling it." Ethan called moments later. "Is it true?" he asked, voice low. I said, "Yes." His silence was loud. I didn't know." I replied, "You weren't supposed to." He whispered, "I should have trusted you, not her." I answered, "That lesson comes late." I watched him pace. I lost everything," he admitted. I said, "You didn't lose me. You lost your choices." He ran a hand through his hair. "I never realized. I never saw you clearly." I replied, "You still don't. I'm not here for your recognition." Lily's voice rose again. "You think this proves something?" I looked at her steadily. "No. It proves only that lies crumble eventually." She glared, turning pale. "You." I interrupted. "Stop. Save your energy for your own life." Sophia appeared beside me. "You're calm," she said. I smiled faintly. I learned long ago that calm is stronger than rage. Ethan sat on the curb, head in his hands. "You were right about everything," he whispered. I said, "I'm not here to remind you." He looked up, eyes wet. "I can't fix this." I nodded. "No, you can't. That's not my work to do." I turned to Lily one last time. "You'll figure out who you are without blaming me," I said. She looked shocked, speechless. Sophia touched my shoulder. "Do you feel satisfied?" I shook my head lightly. Not satisfied. Free. I took a deep breath. The weight I carried for years lifted. I whispered, "Truth is enough." Ethan muttered again, "I don't deserve your strength." I replied quietly, "It's not about deserving. It's about surviving." I walked away with my chin high. Lily and Ethan stayed behind, tangled in their own chaos. I touched my stomach and whispered, "We are safe. That's all that matters." As I disappeared down the street, I said softly, "Revenge doesn't need cruelty. Truth does the work." I smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, I felt untouchable. I felt the first contraction and whispered, "It's time." My heart raced, but fear didn't find me. I pressed my hands to my stomach and said, "We can do this." Alone in my apartment, I dialed Sophia. "I think it's starting," I gasped. She replied, "I'm on my way. Stay calm." I laughed lightly. Calm is relative right now. Minutes later, the pain hit harder. I whispered, "Breathe, we can do this." I clutched the edge of the bed. Emma arrived, her smile steady. "You're ready," she said softly. I nodded and replied, "I've never been more ready." She held my hand. "Focus on the baby," she said. I gasped, "Hello, little one." The contractions came fast. "Push," Emma instructed. I groaned. I can't." "Yes, you can," Sophia said. I closed my eyes and obeyed. Minutes felt like hours. Pain, fear, love, all tangled inside me. "I can see the head." Emma said. I whispered, "I see it. I see my life." Another push. Sophia commanded. I pushed with everything I had. Almost there. Emma cheered. Then, silence. I heard a cry. My tears fell instantly. "It's alive," I whispered. Emma handed me the tiny, wet body. I held him close, feeling warmth and hope flood me. "Noah," I said softly, naming him for new beginnings. Sophia smiled. "He's beautiful." I whispered, "So is this life." I rocked him gently, overwhelmed. "I survived. We survived," I murmured. Emma kissed my forehead. "You did amazing," she said. I nodded, tears streaming. "This is not punishment. This is rebirth." Sophia handed me a blanket. I wrapped Noah carefully and whispered, "You're our new life." Emma said, "You've grown stronger than ever." I replied, "It's because of him, because of us." I called Ethan briefly, but didn't invite him. He asked, "Is everything okay?" I said calmly, "Yes. He's healthy. That's all that matters." He hesitated. I interrupted. "No. Goodbye, Ethan." The room felt warm, safe, and alive. I held Noah tighter and whispered, "Your hope." Sophia said, "You're a miracle too." I laughed softly. "I'm still me," I said. Emma added, "And now, a mother too." I stared at Noah's tiny fingers and said, "We'll face everything together." The fear I felt before vanished completely. Pain became love, weakness became strength. I whispered, "This is our start." Hours passed. Noah slept against my chest. I looked at Sophia and Emma. "Thank you," I said. They smiled, knowing no words could capture this moment. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, life had changed forever. I whispered to Noah, "We are safe. We are alive. We are free." Holding him, I realized I had finally found my peace. "I am reborn," I said softly. "This is my life now, and we will thrive." I saw him across the street and froze. Ethan. Years had passed, but I recognized the slump in his shoulders. He looked older, worn, eyes tired and haunted. I whispered to myself. Power over me? None. Noah tugged at my hand. Mom, can we go? I smiled softly. Yes, we can. I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the pavement. Ethan called my name. Emma, wait. I turned slightly, holding Noah closer. Ethan, I said quietly, it's been years. He took a hesitant step closer. I never stopped thinking about you, he admitted. I said calmly, I've moved on. His eyes glistened with regret. I ruined everything. I see that now, he whispered. I nodded once. I know, I said. You don't understand, he said, voice breaking. I looked at him steadily. I understand enough, and it doesn't matter anymore. He swallowed hard. You forgave me. I shook my head. Not for you. For me, I said. He flinched, then lowered his gaze. I can't change the past, he muttered. I replied softly, no, but life did. I noticed the lines around his eyes, the slump of shoulders that once seemed so confident. You look broken, I said without bitterness. He winced. I am, he admitted. I shrugged lightly. I don't need you to fix anything. I've been whole for years. Noah tugged again. Mom, please. I smiled at my little boy. Yes, my love. Time to go. Ethan took a tentative step closer. Can we, at least talk? I shook my head. Talking changes nothing. Life already did. His hands fell to his sides. You look happy, he said. I nodded. I am. You see, letting go was my greatest revenge. He whispered, I wish I could undo it. I said quietly, I don't wish anything. Not for you, not for me. Life handled everything perfectly. He blinked, stunned. I survived, Ethan. And you survived only your regrets. I started walking again. Noah held my hand tightly. You ready, little man? He nodded, eyes wide. Yes, Mommy. I glanced back once. Ethan stood frozen, lost in the consequences of his choices. I whispered, I didn't destroy you. Life did. And with that, I stepped forward, feeling every step solid and free. Noah laughed softly. Mom, look. I smiled, holding his hand tighter. Yes, my love. We are alive. We are free. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of spring. I whispered again. We survived. We thrive. That's enough. I felt no pain, only relief, only strength. Ethan's shadow faded behind me. My child's laughter filled the space between us. I said softly, letting go, that was my power all along. Noah ran ahead a few steps. I called, careful. He giggled, turning back to me. Yes, Mommy. I smiled fully, the warmth in my chest stronger than any fear or heartbreak I'd known. I held his hand as we walked toward the park. You see, Noah, I whispered, life gives second chances. We take them and move on. He nodded solemnly. Yes, Mommy. I exhaled slowly. Years of pain, betrayal, and loss melted away. Free, I whispered again. Yes, Noah echoed softly. I glanced forward at the path ahead, sun breaking through clouds. No shadows, no chains, just life and love and freedom. I smiled faintly and said, this is my revenge. Not cruelty, not hatred, just survival. And for the first time, truly, I felt untouchable.